All right, all right. Aye, 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 aye. Oh, today we don't have the main guy that does aye, 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 aye. So,
It's okay. Lucky will be here eventually, I'm sure.
but you got to take lucky spot. You got to go for aye,
No, I'm not gonna do it. I can't do a proper aye,
Oh, welcome back to another episode of Aye, 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 AI. And Michael, this is the third time. So people always say third time is the charm, but no, this third time is expertise just growing and growing and growing, right?
Yeah, we learn something new every day.
We learn something new every day. But the problem hasn't really gone away, which is okay at one way, but the other one is that the problem is just growing because of how many people are adopting AI machine learning. So when we did this episode first time, we thought there was a problem, but now there is a problem, right?
Yeah, it's becoming worse.
It's
So
becoming worse. Well, where to start? But I guess I will let you go first, make the intro, and we will jump into these conversations because 3 episodes is not enough. We need probably a weekly weekly discussion on this topic.
I think we'd both be very exhausted if it was a weekly, right? I know you meet with people weekly, but if it's the same person all the time, you get so bored of talking to me, right?
Not with you, not with you. I have a different relationship with you.
But sure. So thanks for having me on again. It's always fun to chat. So, oh, my room went dark. So this is one of the problems, and let me talk about my introduction, like about how the room went dark here.
Right.
So first of all, that's life. But two, so I'm Michael Galarnyk. I've worked in industry since, let's say, like 2015-ish. I worked at various companies. I've done a lot of teaching. So I'm a data scientist. I used to do a lot of YouTube. I still do corporate trainings. I have, I think, 6 LinkedIn Learning classes at this point. I used to work at Scripps Research. I did a lot of work on wearable devices. So research into like predicting COVID at some point, just based on like wearable devices. I've worked in so many different industries, and I worked in developer relations, like marketing for developers in some ways. And then recently, I did a complete pivot in my career, and I decided I want to get more technical again because although I teach a lot of courses, I do a lot of that sort of work. If you always teach the same thing or you teach a lot of similar things based on the need, then you don't grow as much, in my opinion. So I decided to go back to school for a PhD in machine learning at Georgia Tech. So that's what I do right now. I do a lot of work on LLMs for finance, essentially, NLP for finance, ML for finance. I do a little bit of work on LLM alignment, if you know what that is. So I do a lot of various things. Is probably the best way to explain it. In addition, I also teach some vets on the side as well with the CEF. So
Well, hold on. I know alignment because you had to talk to me about alignment, right?
yeah.
But let's get into that piece because I think there's a lot of interest in chatbots and there's a lot of interest in large language model, not necessarily just in finance, but everybody in the planet wants access to chatbots. And they have a very limited understanding of chatbot and very different understanding of AI. So let's try to link that bridge and then talk about alignment a little bit because alignment is a valuable piece that everybody will have to work through for the next few years to come.
Yeah. So first of all, people don't know something. One way to get an introductory knowledge on something is to use an LLM. So if I were to read off a ChatGPT 4.0 version of like what is LM alignment, you can have like a very quick dictionary definition of it's the process of ensuring that LLMs behave in ways that are consistent with human values, preferences, and expectations. So basically, it depends on your field, but you want to make sure the LM has really good output. So there's a lot of different ways to do alignment. For some of my research right now, it's making sure that LLMs align on social norms, essentially. So you need to close the microwave. Like it's good to close the microwave after you use a microwave, or it's proper to flush a toilet or something. Like simple, very simple things, but make sure they align with humans and groups of humans, because a lot of like social values, for example, are implied. They're not uniform across demographic groups. So I do a lot of work on that sort of thing. It's not easy be challenging. There's a lot of different ways to do that. But yeah, and then also if LLMs are malaligned with humans, they don't represent our values, then it becomes a problem, essentially.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
no explicit, like ground truth for you have to do this kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we talked about is alignment and ontology, right?
Mhm.
So ontology, you got alignment, but tell us a little bit about that, because ontology is what it sounds like, but alignment is a little bit more specific to an organization or their use cases.
Mhm. So going back to the definition of LLM alignment, it's really just, making sure things have human values, ethics, user intentions, that sort of thing.
Corporate
And that's,
policies and things of
yeah,
that nature, right?
and it's avoiding bias output,
Right.
essentially. For ontology, there's a lot of different ways to think of it. Ontology is some sort of framework that you can define relationships between different concepts within a specific domain.
Right.
So it's
Like
organizing knowledge into categories, and that's hard.
physics, cultures, things like that, right?
Yeah, and it's not
Ups and
easy.
downs. Yeah, it's not that easy. No.
And then so ontology differs between fields. It differs in a
Right.
lot of different ways, and even making ontologies is challenging on its own.
Right.
Because the way you organize knowledge also, if you look from like an LM point of view, ontologies can help you train models. Like the way you organize data, if you put data in a certain structured format and have an LLM learn some sort of graduate learning, maybe that matters as well, if you think about it. Because the way humans learn when we're kids, we learn from experience, but we also learn in order. There's something called curriculum learning in machine learning, where you first learn how to add and subtract, and then you learn, multiplication. Then you learn so many different things going on throughout grade school, high school, and you learn some algebra, you learn some calculus. You learn from a general strategy, and you can mimic that in some ways with LLMs, essentially.
Yeah. And just from this simple conversation about just these two topics, you can tell that when there's a business value to be captured and a business decision to be made,
Mhm.
these are pieces of the conversations that people have to have. And if you think about it, like when we were discussing this topic, I was kind of going over your head and you're going over my head, right?
Mhm.
Like it's difficult even for us to conversate. And
Yeah.
then I realize how painful it is for somebody who doesn't work with AI on a daily basis. Like literally, I've been doing these workshops for 7, 8 years now because I find the value in this communication piece. Because if you think about a life cycle of a project from the ideation to implementation, if it takes 6 months minimum, if you take the communication piece and create a team that is able to communicate with each other, I think that 6 months will turn into 3 months. Like I just
Yeah.
want to challenge myself for that, because I think within a 6 months, if you're just able to reduce that communication jargon, the communication problems,
Yeah.
you capture the idea much better, faster, and deploy with ease, right?
Yeah.
But the best part of this whole life cycle is that you don't want to have a project on AI for 6 months. You
Yeah.
want to have a project that lasts for 3 days, because you're continuously developing, continuously integrating, because your ML ops, when it becomes AI ops, you don't have the luxury of 6 months version iterations. You don't
No.
have the luxury of training, releasing, validate, validate, validate. It's super important. So I think we're onto something here, right? Because you write lots of papers and you write lots of these new alignment information that people need to know, but we really need to get it out there, get it out to people, so that way they can come back to a certain, say, video or certain
Mhm.
information bucket, right? That they all can come in and say, you know what, everybody needs to jump into this single video, right?
Mhm.
Because in YouTube right now, you got IBM, you got Palantir, you have so many resources that you can go to and say, well, I learned it from 5 different locations. How many locations did you learn it from? And neither one of us ever will cross the path, because we're learning from different silos of information. So I think this is important, that we talk about these topics and then have people come to a single source of information to say, how do we talk about it from here? Because we know, everybody in our team knows, right?
Mhm.
So I think Knowledge management. Let's not get into that. It's a big
Yeah,
topic.
but communication is very important, and being able to communicate on a similar level is very important. People have different perspectives, but if you can't communicate your ideas to someone, then things get done a lot slower, or there's delays, or projects don't happen, or just life in general doesn't happen. You have to
The
communicate every day about things.
biggest lessons I've seen is the emotional intelligence piece, right? Where there's companies that are thinking about artificial intelligence. I'll tell you the best example. I always use it is like they had 11 cybersecurity guys, cybersecurity, top-notch cybersecurity, PhDs, and just very knowledgeable in cybersecurity. Never done AI work. All of a sudden, they were thrown into a project. Said, "You guys are all cybersecurity techies, right? Go do AI." They were told to go do AI, right? And then they did AI. 9 months later, they're still asking questions. Where's the baby, right?
Yeah.
It's been such an amazing experience to see that when you have a team that is super techy, but they don't know how to communicate because they don't know how to even ask the question right. And then they don't have the emotional intelligence to communicate with each other, to challenge each other, to say, whatever you said didn't make any sense to me, but I went along with it, right?
Yeah.
It happens so frequently, but I like to use that one because you think the techies will be able to deliver. They had techies with project management skills, but they still didn't have that emotional intelligence behind it, right?
Yeah.
Um,
There's
yeah,
It's very funny. And then these days people ask LMs to help write emails, and people ask LMs to help respond. But sometimes the humans don't give the right prompt to the LM on both ends, so no one can understand anything. There's a barrier between the human and the LM, and then the LM and the human on the other side of it, and no one knows what they're talking about. Essentially, nothing gets done.
yeah.
So there's even with the tools, people still make mistakes.
I've said it before, but our CEO, Gerard, he has a thing called a fool with a tool is still a fool, right?
Yeah.
So you really have to have the education for the tools. But I think one of the beauty of AI tools is that once you learn AI from its infrastructure level, you see AI differently. So no matter what that AI tool you're engaging with, you know how it's processing those data. And having that simple understanding makes a huge difference in communication, makes a huge difference in ability to say, how do we stack these AIs on top of each other? So, we talk about DevOps all the time. Nowadays, it's ML ops. They're coming up with LLM ops, and they're talking about AI ops. How do we stack them together, and what's the relevance of each other? So there was a thread between all of these. I think comes from that understanding of the infrastructure behind an AI. How our majority of your AIs are set up? What's the difference between transformer versus your machine learning? Okay, if you know those differences, you will actually ask the right question, communicate the right sort of requirements. Like I said earlier, somebody said, "Bring me AI," right? And of course,
What are
they
you talking about, right?
yeah, AI with ketchup and mustard. That's what they brought.
Yeah. And I think in general, with people think, that the problems are the same as the past. In some ways, it's true. So, like DevOps versus ML ops versus AI ops, there's different challenges that people are dealing with. These days, when you have machine learning in a loop, there's different requirements for different problems. So, for like a really simple example, for a self-driving car, if you have something work great in the lab or in your environment at work where you're training a model to recognize pedestrians, crossing the street, in your nice, beautiful data set. Well, for one, you can have a great thing at recognizing pedestrians, but if you're not able to operationalize that in a proper way, you can end up hitting people. And the reason why I mention this is sometimes people have models, but they have latency. For one small example, latency as in it takes time to make a prediction. If you recognize a pedestrian, if you just have like a still image, you recognize a pedestrian, but that prediction takes 3 seconds, you already ran over the person, you're driving away. Like it's like that's the big problem, right? That's like one simple issue. Another thing is like, are you overrunning the LM with requests? Are you putting too much data into it? Um, and are you overrunning your system? Are you overrunning your GPUs? Are you able to feed data in properly? The challenges are still there. They're just there in sometimes a different way.
Yeah.
it's not just connecting things, make sure they actually work for your use case and also in production, which is a big deal.
Yes, because what works in dev versus the
Mhm,
actual production environment is two different story. And I'm not laughing about pedestrian getting hit. I'm
mhm.
laughing about the fact
No.
that there was a meme
Mhm,
where a truck had bunch of traffic lights in it.
mhm,
The what is it? Red, green, and yellow, right? Red,
mhm.
yellow, and green. So there's a bunch of traffic lights on the back of a truck, and the truck was driving the highway.
Yeah.
So the meme says it's a nightmare for Tesla.
Mhm.
Because Tesla's looking at it like, when do I stop? When do I stop? Do
Yeah.
I stop now?
And you have to have edge cases for your models too. And I know it's kind of going on a little bit of a tangent, but when you like for the self-driving aspect of it, you have to have, representative data. If the models are being trained, those Waymos and all those other cars, they're trained in, let's say, Bay Area and Phoenix, they have very different geographies, very different people, they have different road signs than what you have in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains, like, or in a different country with different languages. And there's not a lot of data on construction sites and car accidents and all this sort of stuff that you need to train models on. So it's that your prod matches your test in some ways, and how you do that in a representative way.
Yeah.
And even for all that, you still have to make sure that you're able to deal with things that you'll never have in a computer setting unless you. We were talking earlier before the podcast about known unknowns and unknown, like
Yeah.
something like that. Like basically, you don't always know what the issues are going to be. So
Yeah.
people in real life, for a lot of these like self-driving car companies, for a lot of their cameras, they sometimes try to make them look like they're malfunctioning, like make sure there's like a leaf on it or something, or peanut butter, or whatever it happens to be, so that does the model still work when it has less information coming into it? Does it recognize when a camera is down or it's lidar, basically like how it scans the surroundings are down,
Yeah.
It-
And one of the things that we talk about DevOps, MLOps, and AI ops. Well, if you think about DevOps, one of
Mhm,
the things that we not really are accustomed to is figuring out the cost of
mhm.
productionalized product, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it is that we release from DevOps, the cost of it is measurable and containable, right? And when you do version iterations, the release of new patches to it, you see
Mhm,
cost is not ballooning beyond control. But with MLOps, I think that's the biggest difference. Like you can put MLOps instead of DevOps all you want, but
mhm,
MLOps, once you are releasing whatever that is you released out into the production or the
mhm.
environment, boy oh boy, your cost either will balloon or nothing's will work.
Yeah.
Pick one, right? Do you
Mhm,
want to just have a ballooning cost or things that doesn't work, right?
yeah.
So I think we're creating a thread here, right? The thread is just like a car will hallucinate, so does a large language model, right?
Mhm,
Just like a car will have a bias, a large language model will have a bias. But
yeah.
the biggest threat is that just like your brain, which is our brain between our 2 ears, um, it has bias. It
Yeah.
has hallucination. It has the same problem that an AI system will. So for a company to say, not a company, let's say, for example, a team that has a good budget, one of the things that they forget is the financial justification does not mean financial justification of developing and implementing. It's
Yeah.
financial justification for implementing, then sustaining and scaling it,
Yeah.
because that's your biggest cost out of MLOps, right? Uh,
Mhm,
it, it's been amazing to see how people come in from different angle, but they all come in from historical perspective, right? Because
mhm.
DevOps is our history, MLOps is the future, and
Yeah.
AI ops is the reality, right? We're gonna have to live through those.
Oh,
Yeah, amazing discussion here.
we keep
Love it.
on going on the cost aspect of this a little bit because I just for what you're talking about with AI ops. So some of these models are huge. These like the Llama 3.1 405 billion parameters. You can't host that in normal GPU. Even if you have the model, let's say the model you can find it like a floating point 16, which basically just means it has a lot of bits. But when you want to put in production, it might be too big for a use case. It might cost too much to inference, just like one example, to actually make financial sense, right?
Yeah.
It's not just that you need to have a giant, series of GPUs to be able to host this thing, but it's the resources, it's the time, it's the memory requirements. Like you can't run models the same way. And then even if you host something in the cloud, you have data transfer issues. And even for a lot of applications, some of these large language models that, let's say they can actually do a task and do it really well, it's not just latency, it's does the cost per unit actually make sense for a prediction? Like you said, it's very, very different.
Yeah, I think I love those numbers, but let me put it in the story context
Yeah.
here, right? The fact that there's companies that are putting you on queue right now saying, if you give us this much money, we can guarantee you some GPU time
Yeah.
later on, not today,
Hmm.
later. That should tell you the difficulty of what happens with GPUs and, of course, booking the time to use those GPUs, right?
Hmm.
Do you see like how difficult it would be for somebody that doesn't understand how GPU works to say, oh, just like the servers, I'll just buy the server rack. Like, no, sir. Your GPU has to be rented and there's a line for it. So
Hmm.
even if you want to get started in your project, I'm sorry, you're not going to start tomorrow. You're going to start
Yeah.
probably a few months from now.
And
If
this is always dynamic too. Things can change, this week, next week. The line can get short, can get longer. Like
longer,
you have to be able to factor all this stuff in when you want to do a project. Are we able to have the resources for it? Will there be resources in the future? Are the resources now? It's very complex in a lot of different ways.
complex as in you have to talk about geopolitics of things,
Yeah,
right?
there's also geopolitics there
Yeah.
too.
You're not getting to Chinese market and say, oh, I'm just going to process my data in China, just like I manufacture things in China.
Yeah. It
No,
might not happen for most industries or a lot of industries, right?
that
It's not even just that, but even the financial perspective on like how much it cost me today. A lot of these startups that are using GPUs, a lot of this stuff has been subsidized by venture capital money too.
that's right.
So a lot of startups are like, oh yeah, we built a product, and it costs us this much to inference or whatever.
Mhm.
Well, these days, there's the venture capital money is not flowing as easily, and these startups need to start making a profit. Are they profitable in today's economy, especially as the cost of things goes up? Are you profitable today? Or are you going to be profitable tomorrow? Does it make actually sense to have a more accurate model or a model that's cheaper to inference? Like
Cheaper
there's,
to inference would be my preference, right?
yeah,
But I got to tell you, when ChatGPT went down for 8 hours,
mhm.
I stopped working. I just said, well, what am I going to do now?
Yeah. It depends on
Maybe
what
I have
you're
to
looking
look for a
for, right?
different profession.
Yeah, you got to be able to do work with and without the tools, right? So with AI on the loop, it ideally you have some sort of fail safe to be able to do something when things go down. So if you have an API and you're, inferencing from OpenAI or Google or Microsoft or whatever you have to be doing, are you able to deal with when they have issues,
Right.
not just when you have issues on your end? I think that's actually a really good life skill in general.
That's right.
It's do you build things robustly so that things can still work when there's a problem?
Is
So
it scalable? Is it sustainable? Is it interoperable? Where's your interoperability? Where's your sustainability? Where's your scalability
mhm,
when it comes to your ML models, right?
mhm,
So don't train the data just to train the data and say it's cool. What
mhm,
happens to it after you deploy it? And of course, what happens to the cost of it in life cycle of it? I mean, not
mhm,
the life cycle, but post deployment life cycle.
yeah,
So um, I think we're onto something here because the value of investment is very obvious, right? Value of investment that you have to identify your use cases, and not all use cases are equal.
mhm,
So, what is the? I always use the terminology of blast radius. So, if you find a use case that is in the center, how do you find the furthest use case from it and work your way into it, right?
yeah,
And how do you create an ecosystem of use cases rather than a single use case that everybody can get wowed by, right?
mhm,
Um, and of course, like we talked about ChatGPT going down for 8 hours. I don't think it was 8 hours. It was a few hours. I just
mhm.
remember it was 6 o'clock at night, and I'm thinking like, what am I gonna do for the rest of the night because ChatGPT is down?
Yeah, you have a deadline, you have things to do, right?
Things to do. So this idea, the notion that you have nothing to invest in, I think investment needs to start with the people, right?
Yeah,
So you have this people, process, and technology. So if you identify the right team and that right team goes to the right process, DevOps, MLOps, AIOps, whatever LLM ops you have, but what is it you're delivering is the technology. So your people are the most important part of your process. And if you have the right people with the right language, right communication skills, right set of tools and knowledge, they will do great. And how much of communications do they do, and how long have they been training, will make all the difference. And let's talk some of these topics about, like, IBM and AWS and Accenture. All these big guys are coming up with a lot of numbers, right? But
Yeah.
I think they all have the same thread, right? They're saying if your guys are not built for AI, they're going to keep making the same mistakes that they made with the cloud skills, right?
Yeah.
Because back in the days, you remember cloud, everybody got on it, and all of a sudden they're like, bill shock. Your cloud is not as cheap as you thought it would be. And then all of a sudden you have the same problem with AI. Yes, you're going to have the same problem. Don't get me wrong. But when you upskill the people, and that's the investment that you have to make today before you jump into anything, right? Hold your horses, invest in your people, and have them come to an understanding of, at minimum, communications, at minimum, that emotional intelligence. Say, hold on a second, that's DevOps. We're not doing that anymore, right?
Yeah.
Putting a pause into the manager who's very used to DevOps, right?
Yeah.
Very used to saying, like, version iterations, we can do it very easily. No, that's not how it works, sir.
It's not easy at all with models.
No, exactly.
And then even for, like, let's say a company is brazen enough to train a model from scratch. Like these large language models take a lot of money. It's hard to make a good estimate. Let's say it's billions, okay, in some cases. Just GPU hours. Right. So let's say it's extremely large amount of money. It takes months to train these models. Like, to be clear, it takes a very long time to train the models. And then what if you have data drift? What if the world changes around you? So pre-code versus after code are very different worlds, for example. So if you have, let's say, images are easiest to explain, even though it's not my typical field. So for images, if you saw someone in a mask in 2019 or 2018, and they're on the laptop on the floor and their kids nearby them, it's like, oh, they're probably at home relaxing. Whereas if you show that image during the height of the pandemic, well, a model needs to have a thought, at least, or at least a suspicion that I know models don't think, I get it, but that it could be that they're actually working, right? It's very different. So for DevOps, you continuously, let's say you build from scratch every time you deploy, or something crazy, like whatever you happen to do, because I'm not a DevOps person. But for models, you can't train a model from scratch, nightly. It's just not happening. It's like complete from scratch. So you have to fine tune a model. But even then, are you able to keep on getting new, fresh data that represents the real world into your model to kind of fine tune the model? Are you able to do that effectively, cheaply? So there's a lot of math, and there's a lot of computational tricks, and a lot of adapters you can do on models for different use cases, and to keep them up to date and current. Because there's a model drift, and models performance for models. Like, eventually, if you put in production, the performance will go down over time depending on the use case, and you have to keep on continuously retraining models.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So the continuity of it, right? What you're talking about is monitoring and triggering, right? If you're monitoring your model in a deployed environment, well, if you monitor, that's fine, because we do that all the time with everything, right? Batch process data, so many things we have to monitor on IT system. Well, can you trigger anything, right?
Yeah.
If you're not able to trigger, if you're not able to pull back on that model and say, like, yeah, before you start drifting that way, let me fix you real quick, right? Who's going to do that? Is it your internal employee that's going to pull that trigger, or is it going to be somebody from, say, Accenture that comes in 48 hours later or 48 days later, right? By then, your models are destroyed. Right?
Yeah.
Well, so you have to have all these people side of things acknowledged, because monitoring and triggering is where you see the highest value add. Because if it's drifting, you're drifting with it.
Yeah.
And your business is going to drift with it too.
And like models, they silently fail versus a lot of times for software, it's just broken. So I was coming to work today on public transportation, and maybe there's a software update, but a lot of people had trouble getting through like the turnstiles with our low cards or whatever. So that's broken. It's very obvious something's broken. But for models, it can silently err in some ways. If it doesn't make as good predictions, you may not notice it. If it's a image recognition application, you might not notice that it's failing. There's not going to be an alert sent to the engineer somewhere that something's broken, right? Unless you have some sort of continuous testing or something. So it's a different sort of problem sphere that you end up getting. It gets more complicated. It's not just that the software's down; it's the model's just making less good predictions. And how can you tell? And
I think what you mentioned earlier, I put it, I call it a PESTEL, right? PESTL. So you're analyzing all these laws and all the politics, all the socioeconomic things that are happening, technology changes. So this PESTEL, just to hit on that from yesterday's news and a few years ago, what happened with the unions. So the union, as of yesterday, in the ports all around East Coast are not working,
yeah.
and they all just walked off. And then you have, just to draw another thread here, unions a few years ago, when that happened in Hollywood, where everybody in Hollywood just stopped writing, stopped working, nobody's casting any movies. So you have all these issues. And then you have unions up in Michigan that's protesting against, manufacturing. So what's happening as of yesterday will impact in Christmas, right?
Mhm.
If you're talking about predictive analytics, time series, and all this, tools that you have in place, if you don't know that unions are a thing and the unions striking will impact your business in Christmas,
Mhm.
you have a whole lot of things that you have to work through, right?
Yeah.
And the way you are able to do that is by training your people to say, hey, look, you know a whole lot about AI and data modeling, but do you understand the impact in my business if the union doesn't open up the ports within the next 48 hours?
Yeah, is
What
that
sort of
representing
steps do you
your
take
data
for
for
the
prediction?
models, right?
And typically, it's not. Modeling is a very complex sort of process. It's not just that if you have the data for it, does the model that you chose, way back in the day, account for that sort of thing in the data? Has it historically been there to make a prediction? And what you see right now
Oh,
is
as you can
like
see, you can predict that.
yeah, and then now what you see is you can't see anything. So I have to like walk over here to make sure light comes back on because we have these lights that go on and off. But so for the port stuff, a lot of models don't account for that, and the humans have to be able to know that like this might actually affect our models in some way, shape, or form. So you have
and,
to
and
don't just assume it's magically to know it. For an example of this, that's like I see in class all the time.
yeah,
So I used to give students an example where they had to predict like home prices, and I gave them like everything you could use. Like I gave them, square foot, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, does it have a pool? Is it near the ocean? Binary feature for that. I even get it latitude, longitude. I gave it, some sort of information like what it's near. Is it near like certain stores or whatever?
right,
And like for housing, people always say, housing is a lot of it's determined by location, location, location.
right.
So there's some areas where, like clearly just by where it is, it could have no square footage, no nothing, and it'll be priced well. But I was teaching a lecture on, I think, decision trees and random forests, and for the feature importance metric, like no one's feature importance was latitude and longitude, like on all their models, like it was zero, right? And their model had really, really bad. Their models had really, really bad performance near the coast, right? And like Seattle proper, because even though I know that, you think that AI is just magical, it's going to pick that up. Do the
Right.
features actually represent that? Are the features in a certain structured format that models are able to pick that up?
Right.
So models aren't magical. I think one of the problems that we have right now is that people think they are.
Mhm.
So when things with the
They
port
do.
happen,
Definitely do. Yeah.
yeah, are you accounting for that? Are you accounting for that sort of variable? Does the model are you structured in such a way that model could understand that?
My favorite example that you put out is when the feds will come out and brief. What was it, Powell or
Yeah,
who's the last guy? Feds briefing when they do the
Jerome Powell. Yeah,
yeah, Jerome Powell, right?
yeah,
I love that example because the models are not predicting what Jerome Powell just said out of his mouth 2 hours ago, right?
yeah.
Like simple words that he will say will cause such an impact in the
If
whole
he's
mortgage
like,
industry.
"We're gonna raise interest rates to 20%." By the way,
Right.
they're like at 5 now,
Yeah.
whatever. They just lowered it by 0.5%.
5% a few days
And the
ago.
market was maybe expecting originally like a 0.25, and it estimated it up. Like people probably heard about before and maybe went to 0.5. But if he goes out and says that,
Yeah.
that's going to affect your prediction models. Like some major black swan event will change everything, right? Unemployment goes up to 8%, and maybe your models didn't account for that before. It's going to affect a lot of things in industry. This port stuff, it can affect a lot of things in industry if you didn't account for it.
Hey, we were talking about like not necessarily just East Coast, because
Yeah.
geographically East Coast, but by the time the truck ends in California, the truck stops in California, what happened, right? Did that truck ever make it that far, right?
Hmm.
Why didn't it make it that far? What's happening to my supply chain? So I think that like the reason the thread of that is important, because understanding that what happens in union strike in Hollywood is something that your models have to really understand through a large language model, right?
Yeah.
This concept of, if I see a pattern of information, how do I tap into those patterns of information continuously? So, for example, you're getting data fed from Bloomberg all the time through API, right?
Hmm.
Your models are continuously developing that. Perfect, great. Somebody's going to give you that service as a small business. Well, not a small business, like a medium-sized business cannot afford these days some of these model services. So, if you have a medium-sized business and Bloomberg somehow forgot that that's important to you, well,
Hmm.
that's something that you have to know, not necessarily the guy Jon Snow who doesn't know anything, right?
Hmm.
Jon Snow doesn't know anything, but Jon Snow's director, the manager, who's like 3 levels higher, does he need to come to Jon Snow and say, Jon Snow, better get ready for this, because 2.25 and 5 is a huge difference, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
We really need to do something with that. And but if as a director person doesn't, what am I saying? What am I speaking English here? A person who's on the director level needs to know almost a similar information about ML ops, just like Jon Snow needs to know
Hmm.
about ML ops. Jon Snow went to school for 4 years for ML ops, but the director has been working 20 years in the industry. And if
Hmm.
he doesn't know the relations, the correlations, and the causations
Hmm.
of what's happening in the strike, it could be that you're in a tier 2 car manufacturer. If you
Hmm.
don't know what the union strike looks like in Michigan, or union strikes in LA, California looks like, you'll have some bad days, I would say, bad hours or bad modeling.
Yeah. And even for modeling, oftentimes it's, predicting uh, the most common occurrence for some models, so the most likely outcome. And a lot of data, it's garbage in, garbage out. If your data's not great, it's not going
You
to
know,
do great things. But oftentimes um, for polling, for a lot of applications, um, it's not consistent like geographically. So, like the strike, for example, it'll affect people differently in different areas. So, in small town Ohio, not nowhere near Columbus, it might affect things extremely different than other areas.
yeah,
And so people are like, "Hey, the economy's fine, or everything's fine," but the numbers don't show it in some way, or it's not representing some hardships that people in like rural America are having.
yeah,
You can't be able to fix things. You can't be able to incorporate that information. And you're assuming things are fine when they're really not, because your data's not good. And therefore your models aren't good.
right,
So
right.
like there has to be people that account for that, but oftentimes it's really hard to account for places that are geographically away from big cities, essentially.
Yeah. And
So,
and I always use the example of Toys R Us,
mhm,
because if you look at the Toys R Us infrastructure, one of the things that they've relied on, which is quasi technology and
mhm,
quasi just do everything manually, sort of, right? Um, to me, I mean, look, we can look at the whole pie chart and say these are the reasons Toys R Us is no longer in existence or been bankrupt. But one of the pieces that I always say is that, like, the people side of it, the information was given to the top guys, but not necessarily in all levels of
mhm,
people, right? So AI, when when I say, like, if I have to label AI correctly,
mhm,
right? It's never AI. It's never
mhm,
an artificial intelligence. It's never an intelligence. If you identify AI correctly, you would call it an augmentative system,
mhm,
would call it a communication system, you would call it a early detection system, or at best you would call it a learner system. Because if you don't have a learner system, that defeats the whole purpose of calling it AI. It's just a bunch of SQL codes, right? But we've seen that. We've seen those fraudulent AI things that have been in the market for a very long time. But if you have these systems identified and labeled correctly, you are actually able to approach it with the right mindset, and you
yeah,
can have your whole team approach it with the right mindset. So when Toys R Us was having all these issues, one of the things that they didn't have is ability to communicate the same information all throughout the hierarchy, right? The top guys saw the business intelligence, but the bottom guys couldn't even fathom what business intelligence is.
Mhm.
So I
Yeah.
think that was an important piece of AI, that AI communicates, but AI can communicate the story. So not everybody has to be an expert in looking at a business intelligence dashboard, but AI should be able to tell through a large language model, communicate what's happening through the business
Mhm.
intelligence, right?
And be able, and that's
Having it
also
at
why,
all level makes all the sense.
I mean, for a lot of models also, it could have a perfect prediction, but if you can explain to people and get buy-in, it's not gonna do anything. At the same point, if you wanna validate if a model is gonna, predict well the future, get see the explanation for, like, some sort of output can make a big, big difference. So with the whole port stuff, like, I don't know ports. Like, I don't understand, like, how that'll affect the rest of the economy. I
Right,
could be the first one to admit that.
right.
Um, but at the same time, you wanna be able to, if a model's gonna make some sort of prediction about, how a car wash is gonna do, on my, like, on one of my commutes I make at night sometimes. Well, if the all of a sudden the port strike, starts affecting the rest of businesses, and I assume it's going to affect that car wash area. Well, when I
Mhm.
was driving by there the other day, like I visually noticed that they're actually doing construction work on that street, and there's a lot of mud on the street, like there's rocks and mud and whatever. And the data you put in really does matter. So that car wash, for example, yeah, I'm sure it'll get affected by the port strike. It's a very important thing. People need to be compensated properly, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah,
But their problem is that people happen to do construction on that same street, and the whole point going for a car wash, in theory, is to get your car to be cleaner.
right.
But the city is kind of not necessarily being 100% fair to them in a lot of ways, in someone opinion, because it happens to be that they're kicking up a lot of dirt in that area.
Right,
And that's not what you want as a car wash business.
right.
But at me attributing that to the port strike potentially hurting that business
Yeah,
versus the reality on the ground
yeah,
is a problem. So if a model predicts, if gives a prediction that it'll hurt the business, maybe it's correct.
yeah.
But the reality might be for the car wash owner that, like, yeah, sure, it's affecting business by 3% or 5% or 10%, whatever. But the construction on the street is hurting it by way more than that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think what I've always had to convince people is about that. People processing technology wise, you got the technology, but it's not going to do much unless you have the people's insight through the process and pushed into the technology. So, um, speaking on this topic, like I just love the analogy you made, because city doesn't know what's there and city doesn't care about the car wash. But if
Yeah.
the car wash goes down, well, what's going to happen with your tax revenues, right?
Mhm.
So you have a whole lot of these context into the content, right?
Mhm.
And to understand this context and content by all levels of people creates a ecosystem of shared knowledge, which
Mhm.
means that you have knowledge management. The conversation we started with knowledge
Yeah.
management, right? So if you have a knowledge management that is smart enough to say, yeah, my competition has, all sorts of technology, but they don't have any knowledge management, what difference does it make?
Mhm. You
So these
can't use
people have to be,
something, then
yeah,
it's not a tool really. You can't properly use something, excuse me, you
yeah.
know?
And look, I'm being a very, what is it called, like those guys that are always giving you warnings, right?
Mhm.
Um, I, I think I don't do that usually.
Mhm.
I'm not a warning guy. I'm more of a like, let's look at the problems you have, let's look at the solutions you have, and do more with the solutions and figure out how to get rid of these problems completely, right?
Yeah.
So I'm more optimistic. I see things as more solution, not a problem. But at this time, I think the time is crunching, right? So going back to what we talked about earlier, is that if you are thinking about AI adoption for down the road, one of the things that you have to do is AI training, but
Mhm.
also data acquisition. And
Mhm.
I cannot emphasize this enough. This is why the warning guy in me comes out, right? Because IBM is calling it the AI years,
Mhm.
right? IBM calls it AI years because they're saying that what happened this morning, by afternoon, things have changed already. So that
Mhm.
morning data is already useless.
Yeah.
So they're trying to create this urgency in people to say, you have to start thinking about AI years, because each day in AI world is an AI year for you, because
Mhm.
that's how much data you're losing. So yes, you can do all the trainings you want, but the data that you're losing because you're not comprehending how these data will be important down the road
Mhm.
is causing a mass. I guess I don't have the right word for it, but it's causing an urgency in me to be like this guy who's like, there's a warning, the AI years, we got to talk about it. And it's becoming very time sensitive, and it's very difficult because 7 years ago I think I was like, we'll talk about it, it's not that bad. But nowadays, oh my goodness, it's a headache.
There's a problem. So it's the gathering of data, and then you're assuming that you're gathering data that's easily able to be put back into a model to retrain it or be used for some sort of inference or something, right? The one other problem that we have is that there's some data sources that we need to label manually. Like, and there's no other way to do it. Like, for example, after this call, I'm gonna have a really, really fun day, just the best. I'll be labeling data. I can't tell you what's gonna be, but for me to label one sample, it takes about 15 minutes. And I need to label a bunch.
Yeah.
And there's no other way. We tried everything. And at this point, we're just labeling by hand so we can train a model.
Yeah.
Essentially.
And just to back you up with what you're saying, supervised learning is going to be 65% of all your business use case, where less than 5% of it is reinforcement learning. See, people will love to have reinforcement learning on things that you're talking about with labeling, right? They're like, oh my God, reinforcement learning will take care of it, or unsupervised learning will take care of it. No, sir, sorry. 35% of all the business use cases will probably be a good candidate for unsupervised learning and reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is less than 5% of it. 65% is supervised, and that's what you're going to have to work through, the labeling piece. And if you can comprehend how much work that goes into supervised learning, you will see the different outcome. You would not ask for the outcomes that you ask for today. You will say, you know what? Let's trim it down. Let's just get just this one slice of use case out of it rather than deliver all the use cases.
Yeah, it's like people assume you have magical data. We have data, we have these databases. Is it useful for us for application? Is it good data? Like it's a real problem. And even for the reinforcement learning aspect of it, the reason why it's probably such a small percentage of like use cases in industry is that reinforcement learning from human feedback is just some random technique. Don't think about it. But for people listening, but there's DPO, direct preference optimization. There's a lot of things, but it's very finicky to get reinforcement learning working properly. It's quite a bit of human in the loop, so to speak, for reinforcement learning from human feedback. The human feedback is you. It's a lot of work. So it's not just like magical AIs that are going to come and terminate us. Like there's a lot of effort to make sure that machine learning actually works.
Depending on what the business use case you pick, you will create, like, it goes back to that emotional intelligence, right? How much do you want to frustrate your team? Pick that use case if you want to frustrate your team. But if you want to have a collaborative team, the team can get things done and feel good about it, you really have to slim down and say, well, I would rather have this use case, but this is the one that I should actually take. Right? So that slim use case that I always like to say is that's the furthest one out of anybody's peripheral, right? They're not even looking there. So kind of going back to that known, known unknown, and unknown unknown, right? You will have a lot of your teammates will say, that's really unknown to me. Like I have no idea what's happening here. But you have to have that emotional intelligence to walk them through the step by step to say, like, look, if I do this unknown piece here that you don't know nothing about, but it will actually help you to get to your comfort zone of known, which is that bring it into the blast radius into the center. So that way, all of your use cases are feeding each other interoperably, have some scalability and sustainability to it. Your budget is actually working, but people are rushing so fast into these things that I'm like, okay, what emotional intelligence do I have to slow you down at this point?
Yeah. A lot of life is communication and expectation management for a lot of things. Be able to explain when something doesn't work out and why, be able to pivot, be able to defend your work. There's a lot of that aspect of life that a lot of people don't get. And these are all things I'm working on as well, by the way. Like we're not perfect people here, but I really hope that the communication between like the tech experts and the managers, the end users gets better, because then it can be a more efficient system in general.
To point out what's happening, because you're saying that things are not perfect right now,
Mhm.
but things are going to get perfect. But what's going to change between what we've seen back in 2000s, 2010s, 2020s, and 2030s?
Mhm.
This is one of the assumptions that I've been making out in public all the time, right? What you had is a lot of this infrastructure problems back in 2000. As you
Mhm.
can tell, infrastructure is not a problem anymore. Well, unless you're talking into GPUs and inferences.
Mhm.
But by 2010, 2020-ish, we solved a lot of these coding problems. So
Mhm.
we started with infrastructure, we walked the codings. Now coding is just like, do you want coding? We can give that to you with our eyes closed. No
Mhm.
problem. Coding is one of those things that we've been fixing actually. But I think we are to the third level of evolution, which is that I don't know. I don't think there's any more evolution after this. This is the final stage of it. It's a large language model that's going to code for you using low code, no code, and human
Mhm.
languages, right? And those large language models are going to be what's 2030's evolution will look like. As in, we'll work through these evolutions of, say, fixing that large language model for the next 10 years. But if we don't have to code anymore, large language model that codes for us using our human voices and human typing in human languages, I don't think there's any more evolution after that because you literally can communicate with the system using a large language model that writes its own code and deploys this code and does all this AI agent stuff. I think we really have to start thinking about what's not perfect today, but how do we make a business value out of it today? But at the
Mhm.
same time, it's scalable and sustainable for this future purposes, right?
Yeah, and
There's a
even
lot of work there.
yeah, there's a lot of work there, and for, ML, AI, like, whatever you wanna call it, there's gonna be, first of all, we're assuming it's gonna get better, right? Like, any sort of trend, if you
Oh,
look at
please,
it
please
point in
get
time,
better.
you were assuming it's gonna get better. So, recently, the new models have been coming out a little bit more slowly, and the performance gains are not as high as in the past because we're having, a data and compute issue. Like the actual model architectures, like people haven't had like a major advancement in them in a while. A lot of people just say it's like, yeah, there's a little bit of advancement in techniques and stuff like that, but it's basically throwing more data and more compute at something. So it's gone better in that regard. But are we making architectures that are smarter, that can learn faster? Um, we're working on. There's tons of research going out all the time. There's tons of advancements we're making in companies and all that sort of stuff. Um, Even for like the workforce and reality, right? Like the problems we have now are different than problems we'll have in the future, and the problems that we had in the past are very different than we have now. So back in the day, for let's say you can make an AI that can make a game.
Right.
Well, that game would have been really impressive in the 90s or early 2000s. Use as an AI to make some simple solitaire game or make a game that's I don't know where you hit a ball back and forth or something hit it and then comes back, whatever it's called, the maybe pong or whatever, right? That standard would have been fantastic back in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But we're gonna keep on asking for higher and higher standards because we have better and better tools to help us do things.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with making fires back in the day. Like at some point in human history, it's very impressive you can make a fire because you're able to cook things. But these days, yeah, I have a lighter. It really makes it very fast.
Right. Right.
So our
Exactly.
standards are going to go up for professionals as well as for the algorithms, hopefully.
Yeah, and then that delivering of it will be mathematics, a lot of statistical analysis, a lot of this background information that we will eventually forget, sort of like microwave, right?
Mhm,
You don't have to invent a microwave from the scratch, but when
mhm.
I use one, I have an expectation of that microwave to do magic, right?
Yeah,
So I don't have to know how to use a microwave as long as I can press two buttons, right?
yeah,
Start twice, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, right?
yeah.
So I think when you look at the progress of things, for me, like but one of the things that I always find as an obstacle, the choke point, is the hardware piece of it. But
Mm,
main choke point that I will see that will slow things down is human inability to interact with the AIs. Right? We're
mhm,
not going to be able to upskill all the people at one point. Right?
mhm,
We'll have to upskill them over time. I think that's going to cause a lot of these push and pull situations where you don't have enough AI user, but you have all this AI capability. But
Yeah.
why would you create this AI capability if there's not enough people buying it? So I
Mm,
think that push and pull, I haven't seen it yet, but I think it's in the horizon, because when we're talking about AI users today, no matter what number you look at, it's not crossing billions, right?
mm,
It's sort of like, it's going there, but when it gets to 8 billion people, and 8 billion people, well, we have 9 billion at this point, but
mhm.
9 billion people, it's going to create a whole nother sort of havoc because of the hardware choke point, right?
Yeah.
Let me give you an example, right? If you have chips inside of these things, the reason the power consumption is so heavy is because multiple chips have to communicate using software.
Yeah.
But nowadays they're creating hardwares that are going to be single chip, so all your trainings are not happening in multiple GPUs, but
Mhm.
rather a single GPU, right? Single GPU means you have less power consumption and less software code writing, which makes things so much easier to train. I think once we have that problem solved, then we move into the next piece of it and say, okay, now how do we sell it? Well, I can't sell it because not enough people are using it. So this push and pull choke point, I don't know where it's gonna go, but I think that's one of the things that I worry about actually.
Yeah, I think in general, one thing I've learned, I haven't been in, industry that long, maybe like a decade, right? Um, and I went back to school for doing other things while consulting and stuff. Um, in general, as humans, it's the same way that LLMs need to be fine-tuned over time because their performance decays if you don't continuously retrain depending on the task, of course. Even as humans, we need to continuously, retrain ourselves, and I think in these days, we'll have to keep on retraining ourselves a bit faster because the reason why a lot of people, when they get laid off, they can't find a job, there's ageism, there's a lot of stuff. But, one reason why it's hard to find a new application if you've been very, setting the same job for a long time is that if people don't retrain, if they don't, learn to use the new tools, the new environments, the new education available to them, they'll have a harder time adapting to new worlds. So, like in general, I find that it's the AIs will be retraining frequently. It'll also be us retraining frequently.
Yes,
So,
yes. And we will need a lot more mathematician and a lot of statistical analysis guys to say, what was impossible a few years ago because of hardware wasn't available, but now that hardware is available, how do we get the mathematics inside of it? And my biggest hope out of this push and pull situation is that once we have large language model sort of perfected, you know, through that process, what we will actually fine tune is the mathematicals, right? Like, as in all the mathematics that you need in order for this large language model to work very well. And,
mhm,
and funny enough, I say that is because like our brain doesn't actually have language built into it; it has mathematics built into it, right? It's the neurons are working off of mathematics to understand language, right? It's not taught language to understand math. So once we fix this mathematical issues, like Google is working with DeepMind and other companies that are working on these mathematical solutions, I see lots of possibilities come into play in near future, and I think that's a good sign that we are in that direction. So
yeah. And however things work and the human brain or LMs or whatever, like we're always learning like how things work
yeah,
basically
yeah,
and how to do things better, hopefully. Of course, it's rocky. It's not like, straight shot up. There's a lot of learnings and like a career path. It's kind of all over the place until you
yeah.
eventually get where you want to go.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Michael, we started with alignment, a little bit of ontology, but it's just going back to knowledge management a bunch of times. But hey, every time we talk, I got new hopes, but we have to walk through all the challenges, right?
yeah, a
So
lot of
thanks for
challenges.
being here, brother. I
And thank
appreciate
you
it.
so much for having me. It's always fun to chat, and I hope we can chat more in the future.
Another episode of ay 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 ay. Come on, you give it a
Hey,
go. Give it a go. There you go. I did
man,
this.
I don't want to, butcher things. I miss Lucky as well. We'll see him soon, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the next time.
Okay, no problem.